I just want to tell you a bit about myself. As you can hear, I'm not from here. I'm from down under. I'm from Australia. And this is a picture of my dad who we emigrated to Australia when I was 9. But before that, he actually worked in the Air Force. He was based in Maralinga in South Australia doing atomic bomb testing. And then when he went back to England, he loved Australia so much he decided he wanted to take his family back. So he emigrated to Australia. Dad actually worked as an underground coal miner for 20 years. And one day he was at work and he was coughing up blood. And he showed a friend of his blood on a handkerchief. And his friend said to him, "John, you'd better go and see a doctor." And it had been happening for a while. So he was diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer, and he passed away a year later at the age of 57. Diesel exhaust is an interesting hazard because, you know, people have known that it most likely causes lung cancer for many years, but really, unfortunately, the precautionary principle approach that Paul was talking about doesn't really, you know, play a big part in prevention. So it's a good example where the precautionary principle approach should have been followed. And if you think about diesel engines and the design and the patent, you know, the idea was to actually emit clean air from the diesels. So I just want to talk to you today about why is diesel exhaust an issue. So we know diesel exhaust is hazardous to health. What does the hazard look like in the workplace? And I want to share with you some strategies to lower emissions and exposures. I want to talk about gaps and perhaps you know, some good practices and the way forward. And hopefully when you leave this room, you'll be better informed, and hopefully there'll be an increased awareness around diesel exhaust. I've just provided that last sentence there in a hyperlink to a webinar that I provided through Memorial University of Newfoundland, which goes for about an hour and 10 minutes. There's a lot more detail in that webinar. I've really got only 20 minutes to do this, so this is really just a brief version of that. So if you want to find out more detail, look at that or talk to me after. If I can just sort of put out a caveat there, we're talking about older diesel engines pre-2007. So there has actually been toxicological testing to show that the newer engines do actually put out emissions that are a lot cleaner, and the health effects on animals are orders of magnitude lower. And also the particulate that's pumped out, it's orders of magnitude. So I'm talking about older engines here. So it's really a cocktail of constituents that are actually pumped out of the engine. And, you know, we've got a range of chemicals involving elemental carbon, organic carbon, sulfate, aldehydes, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and nitroarenes. So it's a big number of compounds. And the gases that are of concern are carbon monoxide, nitric oxide, and nitrogen dioxide. What is concerning is that there's a lot of discussion about nanoparticles in the last decade or so. So basically, diesel emission does actually contain nanoparticles. So what I mean by nanoparticle is a particle that's less than 100 nanometers or 0.1 of a micrometer. And typically when you look at the soot that's put out of diesel engine, you do get these small particles, but they form sort of these chain aggregates. There's a lot of attention on this, and the best measure for diesel exhaust is actually the elemental carbon in the core of this aggregate. And if you think about the number of people exposed, and I'm sure you can add to that list, you know, as we find out more about this, there's going to be more and more that we're going to find that are being exposed to diesel exhaust. This is just out of some research done in Australia. About 1.2 million workers were estimated to be exposed in 2011. So what is the big deal? Back in 1999, the Health Effects Institute, which is a non-profit organisation sponsored by the automobile industry and also the EPA, didn't think the evidence was strong enough. Where are we now? The IARC has classified diesel exhaust as a confirmed carcinogen, number one, if you think about Paul's talk earlier this morning. And the Health Effects Institute have now actually reviewed the epidemiology, and they agree with the IARC, so there's no shadow of a doubt that it does cause lung cancer, and there is a dose-response curve there. As I said, it's the older diesel engines, and the Health Effects Institute said the studies withstand scrutiny, but still require care and efforts to calculate the risk. So what we're talking about from the mining workers in the study, we're talking about 12,000 workers, and then there's also truckers in the study as well. So what they've done is they've pulled these studies together, so they've combined them, and they've ended up with 31,000 workers from trucking and mining. And each of the studies have their individual power, but when you put the studies together and do a meta-analysis, what they call a meta-analysis, the power becomes so much stronger. And this is the dose-response curve that really is getting a lot of attention. It's a cumulative curve, and so basically as the diesel particulate builds up in your system over time, then the risk increases.
Vermilion's in there too?
Sorry?
Is Rawls in there too?
This is a paper by Rolls Vermeulen, and he's actually pulled the different researchers together into this meta-analysis. So this represents all of those workers that I was just talking about, Joel. But what is concerning that I see is that if you're exposed to 0.1 milligram per cubic metre of elemental carbon over a 10-year period with a 15-year lag time, so 0.1 is the limit in Australia, and it's a third of the limit in Canada, you've got more than 2 times the risk of getting lung cancer.
The limit's only minors.
Sorry?
The limit is only minors.
The limit is for minors in Ontario, yes, that's right.
Nobody else.
Yep.
Everyone's exempt.
I know. Gravity doesn't work.
Just quickly, just to recap on the panel conclusion from the Health Effects Institute, because it holds a lot of weight when you think about it. They said it was well designed, both the truckers and diesel emission minor study, but there are uncertainties, but it's laid the groundwork for a systematic characterisation of exposure response relationships. I think I'll do this because I'm going to stick my neck out. I need 10 volunteers, so maybe that table there, I might volunteer you. If you can all stand up, please.
Sorry, I got you.
The loud table.
And Thomas and Desiree, can you please stand up too, please? And Victoria, maybe you can stand up as well. All right, so Paul this morning talked about up to 50%, of us may get cancer. What I'm reading from the cancer statistics is, I'm reading closer to 30%. So just say 30% for the sake of this exercise. So what I'll get you to do, this you sit down. All of that, your table, sit down. And then of the 30% standing that will get cancer, unfortunately, that's sad, isn't it, really, when you think about how many people get cancer. One of these 3 will get lung cancer. So I just ask Desiree and Thomas to sit down, please. Okay, now, assuming that you're all working in a cohort of miners and you're exposed to 0.1 milligram per cubic metre, Desiree, can you please stand up and maybe put your hand up? Desiree's lung cancer will have been caused by diesel exhaust exposure at 0.1 milligrams per cubic metre for 10 years with a 15-year latency period. And I just wanted to get that point across. That's a pretty big risk, isn't it? And if you look at the safe level of exposure, and I really don't want to go into this too much, but if you think about the regulators talking about 1 in 1,000 at these really low levels, we're talking about a risk much greater than that. So it really poses a very difficult situation for regulators to set a limit. Did you want to ask the question after, Joel, or? Yeah.
Keep my motion.
I can answer it if you want. It's very difficult to measure at those very low levels, and it's very difficult to measure at those really low levels, one, and we're talking about community and public health issues here as well.
I was behind the bus yesterday.
But we're not just talking about lung cancer here. I just want you to look at that top study. I can't really see very well from here, but it's their parental occupational exposure to engine exhausts and childhood brain tumours by Peters and the co-authors. So, but there's, we're talking about urinary bladder cancer. And a lot of other effects, especially nitrogen dioxide if you're an asthmatic. And if you think about the photochemical smog issues in China. And also, I guess if we're thinking about making diesels cleaner, they're still going to pump out carbon dioxide. So that's still going to be unhealthy for our atmosphere. So it's, the carbon dioxide levels have been creeping up during the Industrial Revolution. I just want to talk briefly about mining because that's my background in both New South Wales and Queensland. So obviously underground miners are a high-risk group, but also tunnelling. What's happened in Australia, the Environmental Protection Authority is actually looking closely at mining to learn from some of the good practices in mining and hopefully sort of look at controlling emissions from diesels generally. So what I've got here is just on the van on the left there. That's a van that travels around New South Wales coal mines, and it does statutory testing. So it actually tests exhaust from diesels, and basically if a diesel fails, if it's sort of above a limit, then they have to actually pull that diesel engine up from underground, and they have to either retune it or just fix the problem before it can go down underground again. There are portable devices. This analyzer towards the right in the middle there can measure carbon monoxide, nitric oxide and nitrogen dioxide. So nitrogen dioxide is more harmful to your health than nitric oxide. So there's been an evolution of these monitors being able to now measure nitrogen dioxide and not just NOx or NO. And there's also down the bottom there's a personal monitor where you can actually measure someone's personal exposure to elemental carbon. Just more portable monitors to measure raw exhaust. Thinking about the future, typically what I've talked about is measuring diesel particulate up to now using mass-based methods. But in Switzerland, diesel engines used in new construction machines must comply with a Swiss particulate number. So we're talking about the number of particles now. So as the particles get smaller and there's more of them, they're going to be a lot more harmful to health. So when you do measure the mass and you work out the concentration using mass number, then the mass is in the formula. It's not going to be as good an estimate as looking at the number of these very small particles. And what's actually interesting in Switzerland, Machines sold in Switzerland must be fitted with diesel particulate filters.
Does that include locomotives? Do you know?
I don't know. I know in construction, yes, in Switzerland from the reference that I was looking at, but I'm not sure about locomotives. I don't want even. I could have to go and check that. So this going back to measuring, what gets measured gets noticed. What gets noticed gets action. And I suppose it goes along the same kind of lines of what John Erdick was talking about. We really need to understand what personal exposures are to diesel particulate, which is available. And I guess, when we do monitoring for diesel particulate element of carbon, we really need to understand the limitations of the methodology. So I don't know if anybody in this room is involved in this kind of work, but this is not a black box, the carbon analyzer. It has limitations and inaccuracies. As you get, there is one paper to show that where the concentration of elemental carbon went below 0.05 milligrams per cubic metre, the ratio of elemental carbon to organic carbon was quite variable. So, I guess we've got to think about the research there is, should we be measuring total carbon rather than elemental carbon, or both total carbon and elemental carbon? I just want to put this across, that sulfur in diesel fuel will make a big difference. And I'm talking about that from my experience. Many years ago, I was involved in a project where we were comparing different fuels in a makeshift tunnel above ground. And we looked at the particulate that was being put out of the engine with these different fuels, and we looked at sulfur. And we found that where the sulfur was higher, the particulate was much higher. And in Australia, there's a national standard, the National Fuel Quality Act, which everybody has to comply with. And I believe in the mines there now, they're going towards less than 5 parts per million. When I look at what's done here in Canada, I'm not really able to work it out. I really need to drill down and understand, but why is there so much disparity between the provinces with the sulfur content? And I guess also if you look at the concentration of sulfur in the fuel as well, orders of magnitude higher for some of those standards. One of those ones is a Canadian standard for diesel fuel used in mining, and I think it's 2,500 milligrams per kilogram. 2,500 parts per million. Okay. Okay, just also the limits. There's quite a bit of difference between limits. So Quebec's lowering their limit from RCD down to the same as Ontario, but both Australia and US are about a third of Canada. And I just want to ask a rhetorical question. Is that acceptable? And there was a case, somebody who got lung cancer that basically was exposed to levels of particulate below the limit, but they still awarded that person the claim for lung cancer. So really just think about visible smoke in the workplace. Are vehicles left idling? Are there multiple engines, soot deposits in the workplace, ill health complaints, state of the engine in kilometres or hours? Are emissions piped away? Are emissions processed through a treatment system? What about personal exposures and raw exhaust emission levels, which can be measured? And can alternate power sources be used? For reformulated diesel, after treatment filters, low emission diesel engines, fuel quality, exhaust extenders, catalytic converters, extractor hoses, run diesel engines outdoors and job rotations, maintain engines regularly, turn engines off, generators in separate ventilated areas, negative pressure, ventilate indoor work areas, monitor worker exposure and raw exhaust, use respiratory protection as a last resort. Emission-based maintenance is very important, and there's a Canadian expert his name is Sean McGinn. He's done a lot of work in Australia helping them with their mission-based monitoring programs, and he's a great resource for Canadians. I just wanted to tell you that. Be careful of biodiesel. You can actually increase the level of nitrogen dioxide with biodiesel. And I see from the Health and Safety Laboratory, they've also suggested that you get a lot more particles less than 40 nanometers, so that you can get more of these nanoparticles generated as well. I just want to touch on what mines are generally moving towards now is going away from diesel and using electric-powered vehicles, battery-powered vehicles. So if you think about the hierarchy of control, eliminate the hazard. That's the sort of the approach they're taking. And this is just a coal mine. Sorry, this is just a coal. These are coal mines in Australia, and just see the limit can be met. So I'm sorry for taking a bit too long with that. And if you have any questions, come and talk to me after, and I suggest you look at the webinar. And I'm also part of Workplace Health Without Borders as well. So I've got some brochures here. I just wanted to put that plug in. It's a bit like Doctors Without Borders in the early days. So if anybody wants to talk to me, come and talk to me.